I never thought betrayal would come wrapped in the faces I loved most. When my son married her, I told myself that every cold glance, every dismissive word, was just an adjustment period. I was wrong, very wrong. It started quietly. Papers slid across my dining table with forced smiles. They said it was for my protection, that at my age I shouldn't worry about finances, property, or legal matters. My son avoided my eyes while his wife did all the talking. They wanted power of attorney. Just a formality, they said. A way to help. I refused. That was the day their masks cracked. Within weeks, my bank accounts were frozen. I discovered my name had been quietly removed from decisions I had built my entire life around. The house I paid for brick by brick, the business I grew from nothing, even personal belongings, suddenly everything was under review. My son stopped calling. His wife stopped pretending. They spoke to me like I was already gone. They filed papers to declare me mentally unfit. I remember sitting alone in my living room that night, the same room where I once held my son as a baby, and realizing I had been too trusting for too long. I cried once. Just once. Then I made a decision that changed everything. I called a lawyer I hadn't spoken to in years, an old friend, sharp, patient, and quiet. I told him everything. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said calmly, "Let them think they're winning." So I did. I let the court dates approach. I showed up looking tired, confused, smaller than I felt inside. My son wouldn't meet my eyes. His wife sat straight-backed, already victorious in her mind. They spoke about my decline, about how concerned they were. Concern had never sounded so cruel. Then my lawyer stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply opened a folder and said he would like to read one sentence from a document signed 3 years earlier. The room was restless. Even the judge leaned forward. He read the sentence slowly, clearly. In the event of any attempt by my heirs to remove my rights, assets, or autonomy through legal manipulation, all properties, accounts, and business interests shall immediately transfer to the charitable trust named herein, and the involved parties shall receive nothing. Silence fell like a weight. My son's face drained of color. His wife's confident posture collapsed. They whispered to each other, panic leaking into every movement. My lawyer continued, explaining that everything I owned, everything they tried to take, had already been legally protected. Not for them. For a cause I cared about. A trust they could never touch. The judge asked if I understood what that meant. I said yes. It meant they had lost everything they tried to steal. The case was dismissed. Their petition denied. And their future, built on my downfall, evaporated in front of them. They didn't speak to me as we left the courtroom. I didn't expect them to. 3 months passed. In that time, my life became quiet, peaceful. I moved to a smaller home by choice. I donated more. I slept better than I had in years. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come. Then one afternoon, there was a knock at my door. I knew who it was before I opened it. They looked nothing like the people who once sat smugly in court. My son's shoulders sagged. His wife's eyes were red, her voice trembling before she even spoke. They said they made a mistake. They said they were scared. They said they were sorry. Then they begged. They asked me to help them, to speak to the trustees, to fix things. My son cried. Real tears this time. He said he missed me. He said he didn't recognize who he had become. I listened. I really did. When they finished, I told them the truth. I said love does not threaten. Family does not scheme. And forgiveness does not mean surrender. I told my son I still loved him, but I would never again put my life, my dignity, or my future into hands that once tried to erase me. I closed the door gently, not in anger, not in revenge, but in finality. That single sentence my lawyer read didn't just silence a room. It revealed who they truly were, and it gave me something far more valuable than anything they tried to take: my freedom. The moment they decided to declare me mentally unfit was the moment something inside me broke in a way that could never be repaired. Until then, I still believed, foolishly, that there was a misunderstanding, that greed hadn't fully replaced love in my son's heart. I told myself his wife was the driving force, that he was simply being pulled along. That illusion died the day a court notice arrived at my door, stamped and official, stating that my own child was questioning my sanity. I read it 3 times, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less cruel. They never did. The language was cold, clinical, and final, as if my entire life had already been reduced to a legal inconvenience. According to them, I was forgetful, confused, incapable of managing my own affairs. The irony was painful. I had built businesses, raised a family, navigated decades of hardship. Yet now I was being painted as someone who couldn't even be trusted with his own name. What hurt most wasn't the accusation itself, but the confidence with which it was made. They had collected statements, exaggerated harmless moments, twisted ordinary mistakes into proof of decline. A missed call became evidence of confusion. A delayed response became memory loss. Private conversations I once thought were safe had been weaponized against me. I realized then that this wasn't a sudden decision. It was a long, careful plan. Every smile, every visit, every forced concern had been part of a file they were quietly building. When I confronted my son, his voice shook, but he didn't deny it. He said it was for my own good. His wife stood behind him, calm and composed, as if watching a transaction finally reach its final stage. In that moment, I felt smaller than I ever had, not because I believed them, but because I understood just how alone I was. The days that followed were heavy and slow. I started noticing how differently people looked at me once the legal process began. Bank employees spoke more carefully. Neighbors asked questions disguised as concern. Even friends hesitated, unsure whether I was still the man they knew or someone already slipping away. That was the most dangerous part of their attack. It didn't just aim to take my assets, it aimed to erase my credibility. Once a person is labeled unfit, everything they say becomes questionable. Every protest sounds like confusion. Every defense looks like denial. I could feel the trap closing, and for a brief moment, fear nearly won. There were nights I sat alone, staring at old photographs, wondering how a lifetime of love could end in something so ugly. I questioned myself not because I doubted my mind, but because betrayal has a way of making you doubt reality itself. Yet beneath the fear, something else began to grow: clarity. If they believed I was weak, I would let them. If they expected panic, I would give them silence. I stopped arguing. I stopped defending myself to people who had already chosen a side. Instead, I listened. I observed, and in that quiet, I understood the full scale of their mistake. They had underestimated not just my intelligence, but my patience. They thought age had made me slow, that years had dulled my instincts. They forgot that survival teaches lessons no courtroom ever could. By the time the hearing approached, I had accepted one truth completely. They weren't trying to help me live, they were trying to profit from my disappearance. Walking into that courtroom felt surreal. My son sat across from me, legally and emotionally positioned as my opponent. His wife avoided my eyes, her confidence intact, as if the outcome was already written. They spoke about me in the third person, discussing my life as if I were an object, a fragile thing to be managed. Every word they said cut deep, but I kept my expression calm. Inside, I was taking notes, not on their accusations, but on their certainty. People who believe they have already won reveal everything. And in doing so, they handed me exactly what I needed. By the time I decided to stop reacting, something strange happened inside me, a kind of calm that only comes when you realize you have nothing left to lose. Fear had exhausted itself. Anger burned hot for a while, then settled into something colder and far more useful. I understood that if I fought them emotionally, they would win. Every outburst would be labeled instability. Every raised voice would become proof of their claims. So I did the opposite. I became quiet. I nodded when they spoke. I let them believe I was confused, overwhelmed, even defeated. It was the hardest role I've ever played, pretending to be weaker than I was while my own child watched me, with a mixture of guilt and relief. But that silence was not surrender, it was strategy. I began moving carefully, deliberately, making sure nothing could be traced back to panic. I reached out to a lawyer I trusted, not through dramatic calls or desperate pleas, but with calm precision. When we met, I didn't rant. I didn't cry. I laid out the facts, step by step, the way a man who knows exactly what's been stolen from him speaks. The lawyer listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When I finished, he asked me one question that changed everything. Do you want justice, or do you want them exposed? I told him the truth. I wanted my dignity back. Everything else was secondary. From that moment on, every move was calculated. We didn't rush. We didn't threaten. We let the legal machine continue rolling forward exactly as my son and his wife expected. On the surface, nothing changed. They still believed I was cornered, still believed the law was about to hand them control over my life. I showed up to meetings looking tired. I asked questions I already knew the answers to. I let them explain things slowly, confidently, as if they were teaching a child. Each time they did, they revealed more greed, more impatience, more certainty that I was finished. And certainty makes people careless. Behind the scenes, my lawyer worked quietly, pulling documents I hadn't thought about in years. Old agreements, old signatures, decisions I had made long before betrayal ever crossed my mind. Back then, people had told me I was paranoid for preparing for worst-case scenarios. Now, those preparations were the only reason I was still standing. My son and his wife had focused so completely on what they thought they were taking that they never considered what I might have already put in place. They assumed ownership was simple, that control could be transferred like a set of keys. They never bothered to look deeper, because greed narrows vision. I trained myself to remain composed even when provoked. When they spoke down to me, I swallowed my pride. When my son avoided my gaze, I let him. I reminded myself daily that this was temporary, that every insult they threw was fuel for what was coming. There were moments when I wanted to scream the truth, to tell them how badly they had miscalculated. But restraint is a powerful weapon, and I learned to wield it. Letting them believe their version of reality was intact became part of the plan. The more comfortable they felt, the less prepared they would be. As the court date approached, I could feel the shift. They were relaxed, confident. They discussed future plans openly, as if my life was already behind them. My son talked about renovations. His wife talked about investments. They spoke in front of me, not to me like I was already fading out of the picture. And strangely, that hurt less than it once had. By then, I had accepted the truth of who they were. Acceptance didn't mean forgiveness, it meant clarity. And clarity gave me control. When I walked into the courtroom, I didn't feel fear, I felt readiness. Every document was where it needed to be. Every step had been anticipated. The calm they mistook for weakness was actually resolve, sharpened over weeks of silence. They believed I had been passive, that time had worked in their favor. In reality, time had been working for me. I had learned that sometimes the strongest move isn't fighting back immediately, but stepping aside and letting your enemy walk straight into the trap they built themselves. When my lawyer finally stood up in that courtroom, I could feel the air change. Until that moment, everything had followed the script my son and his wife expected. They had spoken with confidence, laying out their claims as if they were already facts. They described my life as something fragile, something that needed to be taken out of my hands for its own good. I sat quietly, hands folded, playing the role they had assigned me so eagerly. From the outside, it probably looked like resignation. Inside, I was counting seconds. My lawyer didn't rush. He adjusted his papers, glanced briefly in my direction, and then addressed the judge with a calm that demanded attention. There was no anger in his voice, no dramatic flair. That was deliberate. Drama invites doubt. Precision commands respect. He explained that before any ruling could be considered, one specific document needed to be acknowledged. My son shifted in his seat. His wife's expression tightened just slightly, an almost invisible crack in her certainty. They hadn't expected this part. As the document was introduced, the room grew quieter. The sound of pages turning felt unusually loud, like every movement was being amplified. My lawyer began to read aloud, slowly, making sure each word landed exactly where it needed to. It wasn't a long passage. In fact, it was almost painfully brief. One sentence. Carefully written years ago, back when I still believed trust could coexist with caution. Back when I understood that the people closest to you are sometimes the ones who do the most damage. As the sentence echoed through the room, I watched their faces change. At first, confusion, then disbelief, and finally, panic. The words were clear, impossible to twist or reinterpret. Any attempt by my heirs to strip me of my rights or manipulate the law to gain control would trigger an automatic transfer of all my assets into a protected charitable trust. No loopholes, no appeals, no exceptions. Everything they thought they were about to inherit had just evaporated in real time. Silence followed, not the comfortable kind, but the heavy, suffocating kind that presses against your chest. Even the judge paused, reading the sentence again, as if expecting it to say something different the second time. My son's wife leaned toward him, whispering urgently, her composed exterior finally cracking. My son stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, the reality sinking in piece by piece. They hadn't just lost the case. They had lost the future they had already spent in their minds. My lawyer continued, explaining the legal mechanics with the same calm precision. The trust had been active for years. The conditions were clear. Their actions had met every requirement needed to trigger it. There was nothing left for the court to decide. The law wasn't taking sides, it was simply enforcing a choice I had made long ago. That was the part that hurt them the most. Not that they had been stopped, but that I had anticipated betrayal before it ever showed its face. I felt no urge to smile, no rush of triumph. What I felt was release. The weight I had been carrying for months lifted all at once. For the first time since this ordeal began, I could breathe fully. The accusations, the whispers, the carefully constructed narrative of my decline, all of it collapsed under the quiet authority of that single sentence. No argument could stand against it, no emotion could undo it. When the judge dismissed their petition, the sound of the gavel felt final, in a way words never could. It wasn't just the case that was over. A chapter of my life had closed. My son didn't look at me. His wife couldn't hide her fury, her eyes burning with a mix of shock and resentment. They had come expecting control. They left with nothing but the echo of their own greed ringing in their ears. As we stood to leave, I realized something important. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits quietly, written in fine print, patient enough to outlast betrayal. That one sentence didn't just protect what I owned, it exposed the truth. And in that silent courtroom, with every eye watching them fall from certainty into ruin, I understood that preparation is the purest form of self-respect. After the judge dismissed the case, the courtroom emptied quickly, but the silence it left behind followed me out into the hallway. People avoided my eyes, unsure of what to say, unsure of who I was now that the story had flipped so suddenly. My son and his wife walked ahead of me, their steps hurried, their heads down. Just hours earlier, they had carried themselves like winners. Now they moved like strangers who had lost their place in the world. I didn't call out to them. There was nothing left to explain. The truth had already spoken louder than anything I could say. The days that followed felt unreal. News travels fast in small circles, especially when money and family are involved. Friends who had grown distant suddenly checked in. Relatives who had quietly taken sides became polite again. I saw the shift clearly, and it taught me something valuable. Many people don't choose truth, they choose safety. When it looked like my son and his wife were going to win, silence protected them. When the outcome changed, that same silence turned into awkward sympathy for me. I accepted it without bitterness. This experience had stripped away any illusions I had left about loyalty. Privately, the impact on my son and his wife became obvious. Their plans unraveled almost immediately. The lifestyle they had anticipated vanished. Conversations they had already started with banks, contractors, and advisors suddenly stopped. Doors closed without explanation. People who once returned their calls instantly became unreachable. Watching this unfold wasn't satisfying in the way people imagine revenge to be. It was sobering. Greed had promised them a future that was never truly theirs, and when it disappeared, it left nothing solid behind. I spent a lot of time alone during those weeks, not because I felt lonely, but because I needed space to process what had happened. Betrayal by family doesn't end when the legal battle is over, it echoes. Memories resurface in new light. Small moments replay themselves, now heavy with meaning. I thought about birthdays that felt rushed, conversations that felt rehearsed, affection that came with invisible conditions. Looking back, the warning signs had always been there. I had just chosen love over suspicion. That choice didn't make me weak, it made me human. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. There was no urge to retaliate further, no desire to punish them beyond what had already occurred. The consequences they faced were not something I imposed in anger, they were the natural result of their own actions. That distinction mattered to me. Revenge driven by rage consumes the person seeking it. What happened here was different. It was closure delivered by foresight and patience. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply refused to be taken from. As weeks turned into months, I rebuilt my routine on my own terms. I simplified my life intentionally, not because I had lost anything, but because I had gained clarity. I realized how little I truly needed to feel content. Mornings became quieter. Decisions became lighter. I no longer lived with the constant pressure of expectations, mine or anyone else's. The world felt smaller, but in a good way, like a room after unnecessary furniture has been removed. Occasionally, I heard fragments of their struggle through others, arguments, regret, blame turned inward and outward in equal measure. My son, I was told, was having a hard time reconciling the choices he had made. His wife, on the other hand, was angry, not at herself, but at the outcome. She believed something had been stolen from her. That belief told me everything I needed to know. True remorse accepts responsibility. What she felt was entitlement meeting reality. Through it all, I held firm to one principle: peace is not something you find by winning. It's something you protect by walking away. I didn't reach out, I didn't gloat, I didn't explain myself. Silence, once used against me, became my boundary. And in that silence, I felt stronger than I ever had before. The courtroom loss they suffered wasn't just legal. It was the collapse of an illusion they had built on my downfall, and I refused to rebuild it for them. 3 months after the courtroom doors closed behind us, there was another knock, this time on my front door, not a judge's bench. I had settled into a quieter life by then, one shaped by intention rather than obligation. I knew who it was before I even stood up. Desperation has a sound to it, a rhythm in the way someone knocks when they no longer feel entitled, only hopeful. When I opened the door, my son stood there, thinner than I remembered, his shoulders curved inward as if the weight of his choices had finally found a place to rest. His wife stood beside him, eyes swollen, hands clenched together, no trace left of the confidence she once wore so comfortably. They didn't step inside right away. They asked if they could talk, as if permission itself had become unfamiliar. We sat across from each other in the same room where trust had once lived, and for a long moment no one spoke. Then my son broke. He apologized, not the careful, strategic apologies people offer when they want something, but the kind that come out uneven, tangled with regret and shame. He admitted he had been weak, that he had convinced himself he was helping when in truth he was avoiding conflict and responsibility. He said he had lost sleep, lost direction, lost himself. His voice cracked when he said he missed me, not my money, not my protection, but the person he used to be when he was my son in more than name. His wife spoke next, though her words felt different. She said she was scared. She said things had gone too far. She said they never meant for it to end the way it did. What she didn't say mattered more. She didn't acknowledge the manipulation, the lies, the calculated steps taken to erase me. Her regret hovered around the consequences, not the cause. Still, she cried. Still, she asked for help. She wanted me to talk to the trustees, to explain that things had been misunderstood, to undo what had been done. In her mind, the story could still be rewritten if I was willing to play my old role. I listened without interrupting. Not because I owed them that space, but because I needed to hear the full truth, even if it came wrapped in half admissions. When they finished, the room felt heavy again, though in a different way than the courtroom had. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. This was about choice. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as a single act, a door you open once and step through together. But forgiveness without boundaries is just surrender with a kinder name. I told my son I loved him. That part was still true, and pretending otherwise would have been another lie. Love doesn't vanish just because trust does. But I also told him that love alone isn't enough to rebuild what was broken. Actions have weight, and some of them change the shape of a relationship forever. I explained that helping them now wouldn't be kindness, it would be a denial of reality. They needed to live with the consequences of their choices the same way I had been expected to live with theirs. I told his wife something she wasn't prepared to hear. I said forgiveness was possible, but access was not guaranteed. My life, my peace, and my future were no longer open for negotiation. I wasn't punishing them. I was protecting myself. There is a difference, and it took me a long time to learn it. I said that if they truly wanted redemption, it would have to come from change, not requests. From accountability, not desperation. When they realized I wouldn't intervene, something shifted. My son nodded slowly, as if he had expected this outcome deep down. His wife looked stunned, then angry, then resigned. They stood to leave, and for the first time, they thanked me, not for money, not for favors, but for listening. When the door closed behind them, I felt a familiar ache, but it was quieter now, manageable. That evening, I sat alone and reflected on how far I had come. Revenge, I learned, isn't always about watching someone fall. Sometimes it's about refusing to fall with them. Choosing yourself after years of choosing others is not cruelty, it's courage. The sentence my lawyer read had silenced a room, but the sentence I spoke that day did something more important. It ended a cycle. And in that ending, I finally found peace.